1. The House That Grows. When Nathan and Maria stumbled upon the secluded Victorian house in the woods, it felt like fate. The price was suspiciously low, but they were eager to start a new chapter away from the city. The real estate agent mentioned the house had been unoccupied for decades, its previous owners mysteriously vanishing without a trace. Brushing off the eerie backstory as small-town superstition, they moved in. The first few nights were quiet, save for the usual creaks of an old structure settling in the cold. But soon, the noises grew louder, groans and grinding sounds that seemed to come from deep within the house. Maria noticed the first change. A small alcove in the hallway expanded overnight into a fully fledged closet. They laughed it off, assuming their initial tour had been hasty. But over the next week, new rooms began to appear. A tiny bathroom with a clawfoot tub, a nursery with a rocking chair, and a staircase that spiraled downward into a basement they swore wasn't there before. At first, the new spaces were intriguing, even beautiful, but they soon realized they had no control over the additions. The house was growing, and it felt alive. One evening, Maria entered a newly formed doorway, out of curiosity. The room was empty, but its walls pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. She felt lightheaded and turned back toward the hallway, but the door was gone. Panicked, Nathan searched the house for hours, calling her name. He finally heard her voice, faint, desperate, coming from inside the walls. He tore at the plaster with his bare hands, his fingers bloody, but the voice only seemed to move further away, deeper into the house. Days turned into weeks. Nathan wandered the endless, ever-expanding corridors of the house, shouting Maria's name until his voice was hoarse. The house's growth accelerated, filling with impossible architecture. Rooms stacked sideways, stairs that led to nowhere, windows opening to black voids. It was as if the house was feeding off his despair. Nathan began hearing more voices, whispers, laughter, and weeping that came from every direction. Some were Maria's, but others were unfamiliar, like a chorus of lost souls trapped within the walls. Nathan's final act was to carve his way into the house's foundation, hoping to find its heart. He dug through drywall, wood and stone, until he broke through to a massive, pulsating chamber. The walls were covered in human faces, their eyes rolling wildly, mouths opening and closing in silent screams. Maria's face was among them, her expression frozen in terror. Before Nathan could react, the floor beneath him gave way, and he fell into the darkness. Months later, the house went up for sale again, newly renovated and with several more rooms added. The real estate agent listed it as a charming, spacious property with a fascinating history, perfect for a growing family. 2. The Mirror Child. Sarah and her 5-year-old daughter, Emily, moved into their new house with high hopes. It was a large, beautiful Victorian home with intricate woodwork and a massive attic. Sarah had recently divorced and saw the house as a fresh start. Emily, however, seemed less enthusiastic. The little girl clung to her mother's leg during the move and insisted there was something wrong with the house. Sarah dismissed her unease as nerves, but on the third day, Emily discovered an antique mirror tucked away in the attic. The mirror was exquisite, ornate with golden carvings, its surface unusually clear despite its age. Emily was enchanted and begged to keep it in her room. Reluctantly, Sarah agreed. That night, Sarah heard Emily giggling from her room. When she peeked in, she found her daughter sitting in front of the mirror, talking to it like it was an old friend. "Who are you talking to, sweetie?" Sarah asked. Emily turned and said, "My new friend. She's in the mirror." Sarah shivered, but chalked it up to a child's active imagination. Over the next few days, Emily spent more and more time with the mirror, her behavior growing stranger. She refused to eat, claiming her friend had already fed her. She woke up screaming some nights, saying, "I don't want to go where she is." Sarah decided to move the mirror back to the attic, but Emily threw a tantrum so violent it left Sarah shaken. That night, Sarah heard a loud crash and rushed to Emily's room. The mirror had shattered, but instead of relief, Emily looked terrified. "She's out now, Mommy," she whispered. In the following days, Sarah began noticing subtle changes in Emily. The little girl's voice sounded wrong, flat and monotone. Her mannerisms became stiff, robotic, and Sarah began to see fleeting images in reflective surfaces, windows, the TV screen, even puddles. A pale, gaunt version of Emily stared back at her with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. When Sarah confronted her daughter about it, Emily simply replied, "You shouldn't have broken the mirror. Now she's here." One night, Sarah woke up to find Emily standing at the foot of her bed, her face blank. "She wants me to come with her," Emily said, pointing to the hallway. Sarah followed her daughter, but when they reached the hallway, she found herself alone. The walls seemed to close in, and from the shadows, the ghostly figure of a child emerged. Its eyes gleamed, and its voice was a distorted echo of Emily's. "I just wanted a friend," it whispered before lunging at Sarah. The next morning, the house stood empty. Neighbors reported seeing Sarah and Emily leave in the middle of the night, their faces pale and motionless. When new owners moved in months later, they discovered a shattered mirror in the attic and two faint, childlike handprints on its surface. 3. The room that wasn't there. When the Peterson family moved into their dream home, they were immediately charmed by its rustic feel and sprawling layout. The old colonial-style house had been built in the 1800s, and its quirks only added to its appeal. During their first night, their teenage son, Max, was unpacking in his room when he noticed a door on the far wall. It was strange. None of the blueprints the realtor had shown them mentioned a fourth door. Assuming it was a closet, Max opened it. Behind the door was a small, pitch-black room. It was completely empty, with no furniture, fixtures, or even paint on the walls. Just 4 blank surfaces and a dirt-covered floor. Feeling uneasy, Max closed the door and returned to unpacking. Later, when he mentioned the room at dinner, his parents looked confused. His father, a stickler for details, insisted there was no such room. When Max tried to show them, the door was gone. Over the next few nights, Max kept hearing noises, whispers, faint scratching, and the sound of something being dragged across the floor. One night, he woke up to find the door back on the wall, slightly ajar. As against his better judgment, he stepped inside. The room was no longer empty. It was filled with old toys, broken furniture, and hundreds of photographs scattered across the floor. Each photograph was of him, at different ages, in places he didn't recognize. Panicking, he turned to leave, only to find the door gone again. Max screamed for help, but no one came. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices begging, crying, and laughing hysterically. One voice stood out, a low, gravelly tone that said, "You shouldn't have come in here." The room began to shift, the walls contorting as if alive. Shadows crawled toward Max, their inky forms taking on distorted, human shapes. One shadow leaned down, its hollow eyes meeting his. "Stay," it whispered. When Max's parents woke up the next morning, his room was empty. The police searched the house, but there was no sign of the boy. Weeks later, while cleaning the attic, his mother found a photograph on the floor. It was a picture of Max, staring out from inside the room, his face frozen in terror. Behind him stood a shadowy figure, smiling. 4. The red handprints? The Johnsons were thrilled to find a large, affordable house near the city. The realtor was vague about why the previous owners left so quickly, but the Johnsons ignored the warning signs. On their first night, their 5-year-old daughter, Lily, ran into their room screaming. She pointed to the walls of her room, claiming, "The red hands touched me," dismissing it as a nightmare. Her parents comforted her and put her back to bed. By morning, they found tiny red handprints smeared across her walls. At first, they assumed it was Lily playing a prank. However, when the handprints reappeared the next night, this time trailing along the hallway, they grew uneasy. The handprints were sticky to the touch, but dried to a powdery residue that left no stain on their hands. They painted over the marks, but they returned each night, growing larger and more grotesque. One morning, they found the handprints covering their bed, reaching down toward their faces. Desperate for answers, they contacted the previous owners. The call was brief and unsettling. "Don't let her into your bed," was the only advice the previous occupant offered before hanging up. That night, the Johnsons barricaded their bedroom door, but they could still hear the sound of tiny hands slapping the walls, the ceiling, and finally, the door itself. Lily began screaming again, her cries distorted and unnatural. When they rushed to her room, they found her standing motionless, her hands painted red, her eyes wide with terror. The Johnsons decided to leave immediately, but the moment they stepped outside, they found themselves back inside the house, the front door slamming shut behind them. The handprints now covered every surface, pulsating as if alive. In a panic, they tried to burn the house down, but the flames wouldn't take. As the walls began closing in, Lily whispered, "She's here," before collapsing to the floor. The last thing the Johnsons saw was a figure with impossibly long arms stepping out of the shadows, its hands dripping red. The next morning, the house stood as pristine as ever. A new family moved in the following month, none the wiser about the horrors waiting inside. 5. The Woman in the Walls. Mark and Vanessa were thrilled to upgrade to a historic manor in the countryside. The house had charm, character, and a reputation for being haunted. They laughed off the rumors, joking about the woman in the walls that locals mentioned. The first few nights were peaceful, but soon, Vanessa began hearing faint scratching noises behind the wallpaper. Mark dismissed it as rodents, promising to call pest control. One afternoon, while cleaning, Vanessa noticed a corner of the wallpaper peeling. Curious, she pulled at it, revealing a narrow gap in the wall. Peering inside, she thought she saw movement, a flash of pale skin retreating into the dark. That night, she dreamt of a woman with hollow eyes and a mouth sewn shut, clawing her way toward her. When Vanessa woke up, her fingernails were bloody, as if she'd been scratching at something all night. The noises grew louder, and Mark finally began to hear them too. He tried to pry open the walls, but found nothing but rotting wood. Then the whispers started. At first, it was just Vanessa's name, but soon it became sentences. "Help me. She's watching." The couple turned on each other, blaming one another for the strange events. One night, Mark disappeared, and Vanessa found a bloody handprint on the mirror. When she called the police, they found no trace of Mark, but they did discover several human teeth inside the walls. Terrified, Vanessa decided to leave the house, but as she opened the front door, she saw Mark standing there, smiling. His skin looked pale, almost translucent. Before she could speak, he placed a finger to his lips and whispered, "She's behind you." Vanessa's screams echoed through the empty house as the door slammed shut. When the next owners moved in, they found the walls freshly painted, except for a single handprint, red and still wet. 6. The clock that ticked backward. Franklin family inherited an old farmhouse from a distant relative they'd never met. In the center of the living room was an antique grandfather clock, its pendulum frozen mid-swing. No matter how hard they tried, the clock wouldn't stand. One evening, as they were unpacking, the clock began ticking backward. At first, they thought it was a mechanical quirk, but when they heard the chimes at midnight, the air turned icy and the house plunged into darkness. Strange things began to happen. Photographs on the walls seemed to shift, showing the family members at earlier stages of their lives. The food in the refrigerator spoiled, then reversed to raw ingredients, then to nothingness. The clock's chimes grew louder, and with each strike, the family aged backward by years. The parents watched in horror as their teenage daughter shrank into a toddler, her cries turning into baby wails before fading entirely. Terrified, they tried to destroy the clock, but every attempt failed. Hammers shattered, fire extinguished itself, and the clock only ticked faster in response. The house itself seemed to decay in reverse. Walls regrew old wallpaper, furniture warped into antique versions of itself, and eventually, the family found themselves in what appeared to be a crumbling medieval tower. The final chime struck just as the parents were reduced to infants. The house, now nothing more than a pile of stone and wood, stood empty for centuries until it was discovered by archaeologists. Inside, they found the clock still ticking, its pendulum swinging steadily backward. None of them noticed the faint sound of infant cries coming from within the clock's casing. 7. The dollmaker's workshop. When Amelia and her husband moved into their new home, they discovered an old workshop in the basement. It was filled with tools, wood scraps, and unfinished dolls. Most were crude, with mismatched limbs and hollow faces, but one doll stood out. A lifelike figure of a young girl, sitting perfectly upright in a rocking chair. Amelia was unnerved, but her husband insisted it was a harmless leftover from the previous owner. That night, Amelia awoke to the sound of faint giggling coming from the basement. When she went to investigate, the rocking chair was empty, and the tools had been rearranged into strange, intricate patterns on the floor. The next morning, a lifelike doll was back in the chair, but its head had turned to face the door. Amelia began having nightmares about the doll maker, a gaunt, skeletal man who carved his creations from the bodies of children. She woke up one night to find her own face reflected in the doll's glassy eyes. Her husband began acting strangely, spending hours in the basement and muttering about perfecting the craft. When she confronted him, he stared at her blankly and said, "He needs a new muse." Amelia tried to leave, but the doors and windows refused to budge. The dolls in the workshop began to move, crawling across the floor and whispering her name. The last thing she saw was her husband standing over her with a chisel and mallet, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. And the police arrived weeks later. They found the house abandoned, except for a new doll sitting in the rocking chair. It looked eerily like Amelia. 8. The Hungry Cellar. When the Garcias moved into their new home, they were warned about the cellar. A realtor laughed it off as an old wives' tale, but he added, "Just don't go down there after midnight." Intrigued, they explored the house during the day, but the cellar door wouldn't budge. It was only on their third night that they heard it, a soft, wet scraping noise coming from below. At exactly midnight, the door creaked open on its own, revealing steep stairs descending into darkness. Carlos, the husband, ventured down with the flashlight. The air grew colder the deeper he went, and the scraping sound grew louder. The beam of his flashlight landed on what looked like raw meat, pulsating against the walls of the cellar, and he saw something move, too fast to follow. Panicking, he turned back toward the stairs, but the door slammed shut, leaving him in total darkness. The next morning, Carlos was gone, and the cellar door was sealed again, as if it had never opened. Over the following days, his wife and daughter heard scratching on the walls and footsteps circling their beds at night. One evening, the daughter opened the door, thinking she heard her father's voice calling for help. She descended into the cellar and was never seen again. The house was eventually abandoned. Locals claimed they sometimes heard cries from the cellar and saw shadows moving in the windows. The real estate agent kept listing it as a fixer-upper with potential, but the cellar door always remained locked until midnight. 9. The Portrait. Claire and Ben found the old painting in the attic of their new house. It depicted a regal woman in a black dress with piercing green eyes that seemed to follow them wherever they went. Ben wanted to sell it, but Clara insisted it gave the house character. They hung it in the living room, unaware of what they had unleashed. From the moment the portrait was displayed, strange things began to happen. Clara felt cold fingers brushing her arm in the dead of night. Ben heard whispers echoing from the walls, always saying the same thing. Look at one evening. They returned home to find the furniture in the living room rearranged, all centered around the portrait. The woman in the painting seemed closer, her eyes wider, her expression more hostile. Ben woke one night to find Clara standing in front of the portrait, her hand pressed against its surface. When he pulled her away, she had no memory of how she got there. Over time, Clara grew pale and withdrawn, spending hours staring at the painting. The woman's image began to change. Her smile turned into a sneer, and her eyes became pits of darkness. The final straw came when Ben woke to find Clara missing. The painting was gone from the wall, and in its place was a new image. Clara, frozen in terror, standing beside the woman in the black dress. Ben fled the house, but the painting followed him, showing up in every place he tried to hide. It was always watching. 10. A Room That Eats. A group of college friends rented a large, cheap house for their final year of school. The landlord warned them not to use the locked room at the end of the hall, but they were curious. On Halloween night, after a few drinks, they picked the lock and stepped inside. The room was empty, its walls a deep, unnatural black. They laughed it off, thinking it was just an unfinished space. But one by one, they began to disappear. The first to go was Lisa. She stepped into the room to grab her phone and didn't come out. When the others entered, she was gone, and the walls looked slick with moisture. Next was Andrew, who swore he heard Lisa's voice coming from the room. They tried to barricade the door, but it swung open on its own. The last two friends, Ellie and Mark, tried to leave the house, but every door led them back to the black room. In the end, Ellie was left alone. The walls of the room began to ripple, and shadowy hands reached out, dragging her inside. Weeks later, the landlord listed the house for rent again, offering a charming property with one quirky feature. 11. His shadow twins. Rachel thought the new house was perfect for her family. Her twin boys, Jake and Jordan, loved their new shared bedroom, which had a large window overlooking the garden. But after the first night, the boys told her about the other twins they had met in the room. Rachel dismissed it as imaginary friends until she heard giggling late at night. Too soft and too strange to belong to her sons. The boys began acting strangely. They stopped eating, spoke in low, unfamiliar voices, and avoided the sunlight. One night, Rachel caught a glimpse of two pale figures standing outside the boys' window. She ran outside, but there was no one there. When she returned, the boys were gone. Desperate, Rachel searched the house and found a crawl space behind their closet. Inside, she found a pair of small, child-sized skeletons dressed in tattered clothing. Behind her, she heard a voice. "Thank you for bringing us new friends." 12. The singing house. Sarah and her partner were drawn to the house because of its strange beauty. From the moment they moved in, they heard soft singing at night, like a lullaby floating through the halls. At first, it was soothing, but as the nights passed, the singing grew louder and more discordant. When Sarah followed the sound, she found an old music box in the attic. Its gears were rusted, and its tune was off-key, but when she tried to remove it, the box wouldn't budge. The singing turned into screams, and the house began to shake. Her partner begged her to leave it alone, but Sarah was drawn to the box, compelled to keep listening. One night, the music stopped, replaced by silence. Sarah felt a presence behind her, but when she turned, no one was there. The next day, she disappeared, leaving behind nothing but the music box, now playing perfectly. 13. The Forgotten Door. The Mason family discovered a sealed door in their basement after months of living in the house. It was small, almost child-sized, and painted the same shade as the wall, making it nearly invisible. One day, their youngest son, Ethan, began scratching at the wall near the door and refused to stop. He said he could hear someone calling his name from inside. Ethan became obsessed with the door, sitting by it for hours and whispering to whatever lay beyond. His parents dismissed it as a phase until the night he disappeared. They found the door slightly ajar, and when they opened it, they were met with a long, narrow hallway that shouldn't have existed. Faint, childlike laughter echoed from its depths. The hallway seemed endless, twisting and turning in impossible directions. The further they walked, the darker it became. Soon they began seeing things. Figures darting across the edges of their vision. Children with hollow eyes standing silently in the corners. Ethan's cries grew fainter and fainter until they stopped altogether. When the Masons finally turned back, they found the hallway had changed. The walls seemed to breathe, and the whispers of countless voices grew louder. At one point, they saw Ethan standing ahead, but when they reached him, his face was pale, and "They let me stay," he said, before vanishing into the shadows. The family eventually escaped the hallway, but the door had disappeared, leaving no trace. They moved out of the house the next day, but every house they lived in afterward had the same door waiting for them in the basement. 14. The Plague Dolls. In a quaint, rural village, a young couple, Claire and Tom, purchased an abandoned manor for a bargain price. The attic was filled with strange porcelain dolls, all dressed in 18th century attire, their faces cracked and eyes painted too realistically. Tom found a journal belonging to the previous owner, detailing how the dolls had been infected during a mysterious plague that swept through the region centuries ago. Clara grew uneasy when the dolls began appearing in different rooms, even after she locked the attic door. One night, she awoke to find several of them arranged around her bed, their faces turned toward her. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her as she moved. When Tom suggested burning them, the dolls began to multiply. At first, there were only a few extras, but soon they filled every room. Their faces now bore grotesque expressions, wide, toothy grins and bloodshot eyes. Clara began hearing faint coughing at night, followed by scratching sounds on the walls. Tom fell ill with strange black boils appearing on his skin. Clara realized the dolls were to blame when one appeared at his bedside, its tiny hands outstretched toward him. Desperate, Clara fled the house, but the dolls followed her. She found them in her car, in her new apartment, even in her dreams. Each time, there were more of them, all whispering her name. The last entry in the journal she'd taken read, "There's no cure. We all become theirs in the end." 15. The window to nowhere. Emma rented a cozy, modern house in the suburbs. She loved everything about it except for one strange window in the guest room. It was small, set high on the wall, and completely black, even in daylight. No matter how much she cleaned it, the view never changed. It was as if the glass led to nowhere. One evening, Emma noticed faint fingerprints on the inside of the glass. She scrubbed them away, but they returned the next day, now streaked as if someone were dragging their hand across it. That night, she heard tapping. When she entered the room, the tapping stopped, but the window was covered in smudges, and her reflection in the black glass didn't move when she did. Emma set up a camera to catch whatever was causing the disturbances. In the footage, her room appeared empty, but at 3:00 a.m., the windows suddenly showed a different scene. It was a dimly lit forest, and something tall and thin was standing just out of frame, its bony hand tapping on the glass. Terrified, Emma boarded up the window, but the tapping continued. She dreamed of the forest every night, where the tall figure was closer, whispering her name in a distorted voice. One morning, she woke up to find the window unboarded and wide. Leaves and dirt covered the floor, and faint footprints led from the window to her bed. The last message she left for her friend simply said, "Don't look through the window." Emma was never seen again. 16. The whispers in the well. Henry purchased an old farmstead with dreams of starting a new life. In the backyard was a covered well, its stone edges overgrown with moss. The previous owner warned him never to drink from it or remove the heavy wooden cover. Henry, ever curious, decided to lift the cover one night to see how deep it went. As he peered into the darkness, he heard faint whispers rising from below. The voices spoke in overlapping tones, some pleading, others angry, and one deep, guttural voice that simply repeated, "Come down." Henry dropped a stone into the well, but it never made a sound. Over the following days, Henry became obsessed with the well. He heard the whispers even inside the house, and at night, he dreamt of climbing down into its depths. One evening, he lowered a lantern on a rope, but the light didn't reveal anything. Instead, the whispers grew louder, and he swore he saw hands reaching up toward the light. Henry finally climbed into the well, despite the warnings. His neighbors reported hearing screams echoing from the property that night. When they went to check, they found the well sealed shut with fresh cement. Months later, a new owner moved in and heard faint whispers coming from the backyard.